Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's MIT Sloan Executive Education LinkedIn Live event. My name's Rob Dietel. I'm a Senior Director here at MIT Sloan and delighted to have you join us today. If you've attended any of our past LinkedIn Live events or webinars, you know that we try to come to you with some very useful and practical information from the business and management world that we hope that you'll be able to apply in your personal and professional lives after spending some time with us today. And we certainly have a very interesting topic. Our theme for today is leading high performance teams on and off the court. As we're just getting started, I'd like to ask you to go ahead and use the comments box. If you can go ahead and type in where you're joining from. We think we have around 650 people joining from around the globe. So wonderful to see such a great turnout for such an important topic and to have people joining us from all different time zones around the world. And I can't say that I'm surprised because we have a wonderful guest joining us today. We have Suzanne Abair, who is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Northland Investment Corporation, and also is the co-owner and CEO of the Atlanta Dream, the WNBA team down in Atlanta. Suzanne is a very accomplished executive, and we're hoping that in the next hour, she's going to share some of her insights and perspective as a leader of both of these organizations, what's made her successful and what's made these organizations successful, so that we hope that you'll be able to kind of benefit from her knowledge and experience. Suzanne was recently recognized by MFE Magazine as the 2024 Executive of the Year, and she's celebrating her 4th year anniversary as the co-owner and CEO of the Atlanta Dream. At Northland, Suzanne's responsible. Northland is a privately held real estate investment company with over $8 billion in real estate assets, $3 billion in the pipeline, 26,000 multifamily units with 650 employees spanning 16 states. So they're both very unique organizations, but if you've spent any time here at MIT with us, you know that we have an interest and in fact, a little bit of a background in terms of the sports industry and especially analytics in the sports industry and lessons that can be learned there and applied to the business community. So Suzanne, with that introduction, thank you for joining us and welcome. Would love to start by hearing a little bit about how you're the head of two very successful organizations. Can you tell us a little bit more from your own perspective about Northland and the Atlanta Dream?
Well, first off, let me say thanks, Rob. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and with all of you who have come online to hear this conversation. Let's start with Northland. Rob mentioned that it's my 4th anniversary as the owner of the Atlanta Dream. We're actually coming up on my 21st anniversary with Northland in April. So I've had a longer tenure with Northland. And Northland is, as Rob said, we're a real estate private equity firm based here in Boston. And we're focused on the acquisition, development, and long-term ownership of multifamily and mixed-use assets across the United States. As Rob noted, we have about $8 billion of assets under management. We have close to 700 employees that own, operate, and manage those 26,000 apartment units. And we also have several commercial assets in our portfolio. We're a pretty typical real estate private equity fund. We raise capital, we deploy that capital in a private equity fund structure. What differentiates Northland from probably some other private equity firms is our long-term hold, which is something that is part of our DNA at Northland. We have a long-term perspective, and some of our funds have a longer life, and we typically are holding our assets longer than some other real estate private equity funds. The Atlanta Dream. The Atlanta Dream is a professional women's basketball team that is part of the WNBA. I think most folks know the W is the oldest women's professional sports league in the United States. It was founded in 1997 We're about to start our 28th season. Our season starts we actually start playing in May. We start training camp at the end of April. The Dream itself started playing in Atlanta in 2008 and is the Southeast United States only professional basketball team, or women's professional basketball team. Let me share with you an interesting fact about the Atlanta Dream. When the Atlanta Dream was coming into Atlanta, the community decided, or the leadership that was bringing the team to Atlanta decided to poll the greater Atlanta community as they were coming up with the name for the team. As you may know, Atlanta played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. It was the birthplace and home of Dr. Martin Luther King. And it was actually the community that chose the name, The Dream, after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So for us, we feel it's an honor to have that as our team name. We lean into the legacy of what that means. And one of the things I think you'll find that's unique about us, we actually have developed a important to us partnership with the King Center in Atlanta. And I know we're going to talk, Rob, a little bit later about values. That's a value that is very important to us, given the name and the legacy of the team.
Well, that's great, Suzanne. Thank you for that introduction and overview to both of the organizations. I want to note that you started your career as a corporate attorney, and I'm just curious, how did you transition from that role into these senior leadership roles? What was difficult and what was helpful along the way?
Yeah, I would say, Rob, my career has not been a career trajectory, right? Has not been what most people would consider a traditional one. I did start in corporate law. I started at large law firms, initially in New York City, and then I transitioned up here to Boston. I had the benefit of, when I chose to come into Northland, Northland had been a client for a number of years. So the founder of Northland, Larry Gottesdiener, I had actually started working and closed my first acquisition for Northland in 1998. So by the time I had left the firm that I was at that time, which was Mintz Levin here in Boston, I had come up through the associate ranks. I had become partner in 2001. And in 2004, Larry offered me the opportunity to come into Northland as its first general counsel and to build the legal department. What was difficult? I think what was probably difficult at that time was if you've kind of grown up professionally in the law, in big law firms, you're accustomed to all the wrap that comes along with that. And by that, I mean the legal resources, the colleagues who are only 2 minutes away. If you want to, run something by someone, or you're working on a transaction and maybe you're encountering an issue and you want to be able to think about, how best to handle that, whether it's a drafting challenge or a negotiating point. And suddenly you come in and you're the only lawyer in the organization. And you're surrounded by incredibly smart business folks. But that hasn't been what you've grown up in. And suddenly, if you want to ask one of your former colleagues a question, they're charging you in 6-minute increments, right? And you have a whole different perspective for what that's like. On the other hand, what was great about it? It was Northland has always been a very entrepreneurial work environment. It allowed me the opportunity to move from being someone who had worked on transactions. But, as a lawyer, we would close a transaction. And in those days, we'd create a closing binder and you'd send the stuff off to records. And then you moved on to the next transaction. Suddenly, you're so close to the business, you're sitting in it. And being involved in transactions from the moment that they're being conceived to then after it's closing, being actually involved in the implementation and following through, and being that close to the business gave me an entirely different new perspective. And I think that was really important because it gave me an opportunity, and it forced me to grow as an individual, as a business professional. Although I considered myself a very good lawyer and I felt very comfortable around the law, it was forcing me to learn other aspects, in our case, of the commercial real estate business. And it also gave me an opportunity to work with some really smart people and learn many more aspects about the real estate business than I would have, had I stayed, at a firm.
So with 21 years experience at Northland, it sounds like you had the opportunity to build a very strong foundation for a successful company, successful organization. And I'm sure a lot of what you looked at was in terms of diversifying the portfolio, was probably different geographies, different transactions, different properties. How do you go from that into jumping into the WNBA as an owner?
Yeah, it was actually an interesting time. Larry Gottesdiener, who I mentioned, who is our founder and chairman, has always been a huge sports fan. I've always been a tremendous sports fan. Sports, to me, were such an important part when I was growing up, the opportunity to play sports, although certainly not what the opportunities are today for girls and young women. But I played softball from the time I was 8 through high school. I rode club crew when I got to college. And I felt like I learned a lot from sports, a lot about leadership, a lot about teamwork, a lot about resiliency. And so sports were always important to me. Larry was a big hoops fan. Over the years, he had looked at other opportunities for sports investments. But in the summer of 2020, Larry became quite focused on the WNBA. He thought it was an interesting time for the WNBA. We were sort of watching what was happening with the WNBA. And I think it was one of those interesting moments, because the time when COVID hit and the sports world shut down, all live sports pretty much came to a halt. The W was one of the first leagues, because of the timing of their season and when it would have started, that went into and was able to play a shortened season, but still play their season in what they called the wubble, not the bubble, but the wubble, because we're the W. And what happened? There was honestly, there was a lot of airtime available on the sports networks. Suddenly, all of the WNBA games are being aired in primetime on ESPN. The league itself is getting there's heightened visibility on it. And there's a lot happening. The league is in the spotlight because they had dedicated their season to the Say Her Name campaign. They were supporting Black Lives Matter, and the league was in the spotlight in a way that it hadn't been before. And as we started to pay more attention to it. The particular opportunity came up when we had an inkling that the team might be for sale. We reached out to the commissioner in early January. It was honestly one of the quickest transactions we've ever done. It was, from that perspective, it was a little bit challenging. We probably submitted our LOI in late January, and we closed on the team on March 4th, 2021. Now, the WNBA season starts in April, as I mentioned. So one piece of advice I would give to people, probably don't buy a team when the season starts 45 days later, particularly when you're a new ownership group coming in and taking on ownership of a new team. But it was one of those moments, Rob, that as investment opportunity, saw it, right? I think, Larry's vision in seeing that this league was about to take off, really believing in the Atlanta dream and what, was happening down in Atlanta with the team, and wanting to be a part of that and being a part of the W as the league was moving forward.
So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper, if I could, into that quick transaction, the quick transition, uh, uh, kind of a fast break, I guess we could call it. What were some of the what do you feel like you learned the most from that experience, from very quickly becoming an owner and then very quickly starting the team? Were there any actions that you and Larry took to kind of jumpstart the team and get the season started? What did you learn from that experience happening so quickly?
I think, our original plan, Rob, was and we have a third owner who is fantastic. We have Renee Montgomery, who was a former WNBA player. For those of you in the New England area, Renee actually played her college ball at UConn. And so it was important to us to have a player perspective in the ownership group. And so Renee is the third owner of the Atlanta Dream. What did we learn? I would say our original plan was given that timing, given that 45-day before the season was going to start, and you have to put yourself back if you can in 2021. This would be the first post-COVID season. There was trying to figure out, can we have all the fans in the buildings? Do we need to have, right? All of the sort of post-COVID issues around playing, indoor sports was one thing. The second, I think, for us was, this was a whole new industry to us. And, we like to believe that, we don't know what we don't know, right? And, you need to ask questions and be willing to admit that you don't know. So our original plan was, we're going to ride with the leadership through the season. We'll evaluate, and then we'll decide, what we're going to do come the end of the season. Well, best laid plans, as they often say, didn't quite work out that way. And when we acquired the team, we now refer to them as the Mighty Eight. We had a business operations staff, not basketball, but business operations staff that had about 9 full-time people, 8 or 9, including myself. Now think about that for a moment. So the Mighty Eight in Atlanta really gave us the opportunity, just trial by fire, to have to learn the business from the ground up incredibly quickly. And that was a very unique opportunity, because it gave us insight into things that we probably wouldn't have had so quickly. There were times when we were having conversations and talking with employees and discussing issues that we probably never would have in any other circumstance. Mm-hmm. And so I like to think it gave me such a greater understanding as to the business of sport, mm-hmm. Incredibly quickly. And obviously that's important. It really helped us, obviously, when we then were hiring new leadership after the season after the season ended, excuse me. But I think that is an experience that I think was so incredibly important. The other thing I would say is it really helped us know the types of leaders that we wanted to be running the organization. And for us, at Northland, our values are incredibly important. And we were determined, and we had made the decision that when we were building the team, that we would be a values-based organization in sports as well. You don't hear a lot about that in sports, but that was very important to us and continues to be important to us as we continue to build out the team.
So that was actually going to be my next question, was to ask a little bit more about going into a different industry or a different world altogether. Did you discover a different culture in the WNBA, and how did you adjust to it? And what were you able to bring from your Northland experience into the WNBA, into the Atlanta Dream?
Yeah, it's interesting, Rob. I think it's definitely different. When I went from big law to commercial real estate, I thought, wow, I thought big law was sort of male dominated. And then I got into commercial real estate. Um, and and even though at Northland, we've always had a lot of women in leadership roles and continue to do that. And I think part of that is a testament to Larry and the organization he built. Then when I moved into sports, I was like, wow, this is really still a male dominated industry. Although you're starting to now really see change. So what I think from that, what did we bring from Northland? I think we had, undergone a concerted effort to transform Northland to an employee-focused organization, to really coalesce around shared values, to build an organization that really employees felt, an inclusive environment, where everyone felt like they could come in and be their authentic selves, where everyone felt like they could be heard. And we always focus on that with employees, which is, we want to hear your opinions. We want you to ask. You may not always get a yes, but we will guarantee you that you will always be heard. And so those values became critical to us when we were starting to build the dream. The idea of a values-based organization, the idea of having shared values that can be your North Star, that everyone is sort of guiding what you're doing. But also, we have different goals in the sports organization than we do in the real estate organization. And so while you may have some overlap in your shared values and the values that you're coalescing around, obviously the goals then that your goals for any particular season or your goals for, the year obviously are very different, but are guiding, right? The core values are the guide star, if you will, as we lead both organizations.
So can you tell us a little bit more specifically what worked in creating those values and communicating with employees? We mentioned you have close to 700 employees spread across the United States. It's a complex organization, and I'm just curious, what in your experience was most effective in kind of building those shared values and keeping that line of communication open?
Yeah. So Rob, you mentioned, right, we operate in 16 states. And so of our nearly 700 employees, about 115 sit in our corporate office here. And all the rest are at sites that we own and operate. So we could have a site that may have as few as 4 employees. We could have a very large site that could have as many as 27 plus employees. And the challenge is, how do you make everyone feel like they're part of and connected to, and that we're one organization? You may be, if we're opening a new market and, we may own one asset in that market, you may got to make sure you're figuring out how those 4 employees that may be in Reno feel like they're connected to the larger Northland, organization. I will share with you that when I transitioned from general counsel to chief operating officer back in 2016, I think there was a little bit of, and rightfully, trepidation across the operations, because I had never leased an apartment. I had certainly leased an apartment as someone who went in and needed an apartment, but I was never the person sitting behind the desk leasing an apartment. I had never been on site and worked in an on-site role. And suddenly, across our on-site teams, why is this person who has been our lead lawyer suddenly running all of operations? And so I did something that, for me, formed the basis of how I would lead from that point forward. I took a year and I went out and visited every single one of our properties. And I wasn't going out to see the assets or to see the financial performance. I could get those reports at any point in time. I went out to talk to employees. I went out to meet employees. And over the course of a year, I made a point to meet every single one of our employees and ask them for their feedback. Ask them what it's like to be there. Ask them about their experience. Ask them about things that they wish that they could share if they sat in the corporate office. What can we do to make your experience better? What can we do to make you feel more connected to all of us? And from that, we really started on a different path. And then it was critical to me, after building, let's call it capital with employees and building and gaining trust, to start showing some changes relatively quickly to make it seem like I'm not just out there talking for the sake of saying things, but for actually wanting to change things and get things done. I think one of the things that has really helped in that was probably what a little bit came out of COVID. And that is the virtual experience has gotten better. The technology has gotten better. And in our ability to have like all company meetings, and our ability to have quarterly updates, and our ability to really engage with employees, our ability to engage with our investors. But I think that a lot of it is when we actually rolled out our shared values, and ours are at Northland: own it, think big, create joy, and love residents. Mm-hmm. And so what we focus on is we try to, we have our annual awards luncheon coming up. We will have awards that coalesce around, someone who is living into those shared values. Our communications, we often focus on those terms in our communications, because you want employees to understand that without them, there is no Northland. We can buy the best real estate asset in the country. If we don't have employees and dedicated employees running those assets, because that is for us, we operate everything that we own, so we manage. That is critically important, and every employee needs to understand that they are equally as important as I am in the organization. That's part of how we do it.
So, two very successful organizations, probably both, at least initially, demanding a lot of your time and attention. We run a program, a course here at Sloan Exec Ed called Maximizing Your Personal Productivity. And it sounds like you probably already have that mastered. But what tips or tricks do you have, with such a demand on your time and both organizations really requiring your attention? How did you manage, how were you maximizing your personal productivity with both organizations?
I think, Rob, there are days when I should have taken that course. I think for us, or for me personally, there are days when, and I think you have to just admit this, right? There are days when you may not do it as well as other days because something comes up. Something comes up on the sports side, something comes up on the Northland side. Certainly, there are the so-called off-season, which I think for people not in sports ownership, you think that the off-season, the period when we're not actually playing games, seems like it would be this downtime. It's actually not. It's actually an incredibly busy time because you're preparing, you're setting goals, you're doing your strat planning, you're doing all these things to prepare for the next season. So there's not really a downtime in either organization. What I try to do is I do some interesting things, to help me sort of manage the day. And I have a fabulous EA who certainly, helps with this. But I try to make sure that I have time each day for each organization. I do things like color code my calendars and meetings. I make sure that people know that, I have an open door policy. So if something comes up, people don't have to wait. They can just come find me. I think I have the most incredibly supportive wife and family who know that neither one of these roles is a 9-to-5 role. And they understand that there's going to be times frequently where I am working, on weekends or after hours. I think that the key is to know yourself and know what you need to be able to give those kind of hours, and making sure you're carving out whatever time and space you need so that you can be productive when you're doing these things and that you can operate at your maximum efficiency. One thing I like to do every morning, I like to start my day with about a 2.5 to 3 mile walk with my dog. No AirPods in, just straight up out. And it allows me to clear my head and sort of prepare for the day. Obviously, Rob, we're in New England. I do that, if it's 10 degrees, if it's 90 degrees. I don't love the rain, but neither does my dog. But I think finding those, self-care is a big term these days. I didn't grow up with that term. But I think finding those moments that bring you joy, both at work and outside of work, really help. And then the other thing is, in order to do this, you need to be super organized, because you need to be able and focused. You need to be able to be in the moment and in the organization that you happen to be focusing on in that moment, and not be distracted by other things.
Yeah. Earlier on, Suzanne, you mentioned kind of the level of male culture, male-dominated culture in commercial real estate and law, and then even in sports. But I'm curious, how do you see the landscape and environment evolving for women in business and women in sports as well, as players, as owners, as business managers?
I think I every day love that we're seeing the role of women expand across all sectors. I think when I look at large law firms and women leading large law firms, women leading large accounting firms, women leading large real estate, commercial real estate firms, in a way that, didn't really exist when I came out of law school back in '93. Sports, I think, is really starting to see more of it. They may have been a little bit of a laggard, I think. And you're not just seeing it on the business side in sports. You're starting to see women on the, I'll focus on basketball for a second, but you're seeing it across sports sectors. On the women as head coaches, women as leading aspects of the fill in the blank, football operations, basketball operations, baseball operations. And you're also starting to see women in male leagues taking on much larger roles. And I think it's great. I think the more we get of that, and I think that a woman's perspective, I think people often talk about, do you think you need a woman's perspective in this? I think you need a business perspective. I think you need a sports perspective. I think sometimes we can get hung up on, the male versus female perspective. On the other hand, I do think sometimes women bring a different experience. And so I think about experience versus perspective. And I think it's actually pretty exciting that we're starting to see a proliferation not only of women's sports leagues, but of women in leadership roles across professional sports.
Thank you for that. And I see a question coming in. I'd encourage anybody in the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them in the comments section, and we'll hopefully get to them. This question comes from one of my colleagues here at MIT, Anne-Marie Maxwell. She thanks you for your time today, and she's curious about your thoughts on the future of the real estate industry, especially with rapid changes in technology.
I think Technology has certainly, particularly in the multifamily industry, technology has had a really significant impact from the time that I started in the industry to now. If you just think about how you used to lease an apartment 20 years ago, 25 years ago, right? You walked in to the real estate office, you had a tour with the leasing agent. They then handed you a paper application that you had to fill out. If you got approved, they then handed you a 30-page lease of fine print, which you did or didn't read, and you signed it, and you cut a check for your deposit. And in those days, you had to then go, write a check every month and drop it. There used to be these mailboxes outside the leasing office where you would actually pay your rent. On the operator side, you then had someone at that office who then had to take those checks, post them to the tenant's ledger, then go to the bank. So you had to have local bank accounts, and then and actually deposit those checks. Today, what do people want to do? They want to lease their apartment on their phone.
Yep.
And so what does that look like today, right? Today, you go to the website, you're doing all of your research on apartments long before you step on site. You're only stepping on site if you actually like what you see. Whether you go to the website, you're checking the reviews online, you're then the whole process pretty much is online. Your application is online. We have, really great CRM systems where we can, interact with prospective residents. You can, in some instances, you can have, you can go on and do your own tour. We have electronic locks. You don't get a key anymore. And more importantly, your payments are online. Nobody is going to the bank to deposit checks. Everything is pretty much happening electronically. The other aspect of the technology is obviously, and I'm sure a lot of folks, on this would understand, is the plethora of data that's now available to real estate owners. Data about your resident base, the data about your comps, data about markets. And there's this, I'll call it, in the old days, we used to look at what we called the WAR report, which was a weekly activity report. And you were looking at what your occupancy was, that week, the number of applications. You would look out, let's call it 11 weeks at your pre-lease. Today, there is so much data at our fingertips from, our resident management software and our own internal dashboards that our decision-making is so much more informed than it ever was. And that piece is incredibly important. And that's true across all sectors.
So let me ask you, how are you using data in the W?
We use it in both sides of the organization. There's player performance. And so, there are technologies that are used that both for tracking player health and also for player performance. And our performance teams will actually run through that data with players, along with our coaching staff. On the business side, it's primarily focused on fans. Where are your fans? Where are they coming from? What's your heat map look like? Where are you going to focus on when you're trying to bring in more fans? If you think about it, right, primary sources of revenue for sports teams are ticket sales, corporate sponsorships, excuse me, media. So media rights. So ticket sales, and if you think about it, the interplay between your fan base and who your corporate sponsors are trying to, right, who they're trying to get traction with, all of that fan data is incredibly important. as you sort of map out what are we looking to do, where should we be looking to spend more dollars if we're going to do out of home, where do we want to be spending more dollars, where do we want to be retreating. So a lot of it on the business side is focused on fan data, as you can imagine.
Thanks for that. So a question from the audience looks like Besh Ray. How do you handle change in high performance organizations? And I imagine that could be a player leaving or organizational restructuring. How do you handle change in high performance organizations?
I think the most important thing about change is communicating well and being prepared with a good communication plan. Because whether I'll talk on the Northland side for a moment. If we're going to roll out a significant policy change that's going to impact a large group of our employees, say when we rolled out and went to, it's called smart, let's call it smart home technology. And it was, you have to make sure you have the buy-in of the people who are going to be most impacted by that. And I think one of the things that we have found is you can probably never over communicate when you're going to change. The other thing I would say about in those communications, you have to give the why. I think giving the why so that people understand why we're making a change is really important. Where you can say the why. Rob, you just asked about on the sports side, if there's a change in players, if there's a trade, that's slightly different in terms of the why, right? It's a slightly different how we would approach that. And so I think that the communication is always key. If it's something that's external, in other words, where it might, we may consult with our PR firm. If it's internal, it's usually something that we work with our, depending upon what it is, we would work with our HR team, might work with our corporate communications team, and make sure that we have tried to understand in advance everybody that could be impacted and make sure that we're really explaining why we're making a particular change.
So a related question from Danielle Hernandez Monroy. How is the WNBA organization preparing for the future in terms of culture, performance, and development?
Well, Daniel, that's a great question. I can't always speak for the league. I can tell you what we're doing at the Atlanta Dream. And in terms of preparing for the future for performance, I think what you're starting to see is greater investment in player performance and wellness and development. And if you just look across the WNBA and the announcement of various teams around, building dedicated practice facilities for their WNBA teams, just a lot more investment in W teams probably over the past couple of years than you had probably seen prior to the last few years. In terms of culture, personally, I think the W has always been at at least since we've been involved, they've been at the forefront of being a progressive sports league. And I think in terms of development for us, we're very focused on building the model franchise in sports. People often stop me and say, do you mean the model women's franchise in sports? And we say, no. We're really trying to build what we consider to be the model franchise in sports. And we have no intention of compromising our values-based organization in the process of doing that. So what does that really mean? It means a lot of investment. It means a lot of time. It means a lot of planning around what we want to be as an organization. And then, as you could imagine, like in any organization, hiring the people who can then help you get where you want to go. And that really requires investment in people too. hiring the right people who understand your vision, who are aligned with those corporate values, and then being willing to invest in them as they help you grow the organization.
Great. And a question, I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly, Omalade Simbi Wellington, asking, in all of your experiences, did you have to deal with gender bias attitudes, and how did you overcome it?
Thank you for the question. There were times very early on in law firms where a little bit of the gender bias, and I'll share with you an anecdote that this didn't happen to me, but it was shared with me by a female partner at the time. And this was someone who had sort of come of age in a large law firm in the 80s. So think big junk bond deals, hostile takeovers, like, very large sort of transactions. And this woman thought that the best way for a female associate and then partner to sort of survive was to emulate the behavior that she sort of saw from male partners. And then when she became a partner and started doing that, she started getting taken to task for it in a way that no male partner had ever been taken to task for it. And it was really it was viewed as a little bit of a double standard. And I took that to heart at the time when she shared that with me. I was a young female associate. And I really thought long and hard, like, what kind of leader, if I'm lucky enough to ever get to be a leader, do I want to be? And I took that as, I think and I remember thinking this pretty early on, I don't ever want to be someone who would ever be able to be accused of any of those things, gender bias, right? I wanted to be the kind of leader that was, as opposed to reacting to what I had experienced, to be the person that I wished that I had as a leader along the way. Mm-hmm. And so, although we're all always turn out to be a culmination of our experiences, I think I was actually fortunate. I never really had a lot of direct sort of in-your-face bias that I had to deal with. But certainly there was a little bit of the sort of implicit bias along the way. And you sort of learn to navigate it and find your way around it.
Thank you for that. So I want to turn for a moment to learning and development, which is obviously something we take very seriously here at MIT Sloan Executive Education. All the programs that we design are very thoughtful in terms of wanting to have action learning and practical takeaways. As I mentioned, we even hope to do that in these short online webinars. But how do you approach learning and development in both of the organizations you're involved with, and what has worked best?
So I'll start with Northland. We have 7 employees in our multifamily operations vertical that are dedicated full-time to training. They're split between operations training and sales training, but they are full-time dedicated training staff. They conduct both in-person and online trainings. We also subscribe to a pretty standard industry online platform for certain trainings, which is pretty common across the industry. We also have one individual, we have a manager of learning and development in our HR vertical that oversees learning and development, for the organization. That could be different from either sales or ops training. That would be more like leadership training for newly, we might do managerial training for, newly promoted managers, or time management, communication, those types of trainings. I think that you have to invest in your employees. I think if you have to have, if you want to be an employee-focused organization, your employees have to feel that you're investing in them, if you're going to ask a lot of your employees, I think your employees believe that you need to be providing them with the opportunity to advance and grow within the organization. We love nothing better than having employees who work their way up through the organization. And so providing that level of training, either to help us make sure that our on-site teams are performing at a high level, and are providing a high level of customer service to our residents, or if it's more in terms of learning and development around particular job skills, is really important to us. We put a lot of emphasis on it, and we also support employees in terms if they seek out, for example, one of your institution's programs. So we support and have, tuition reimbursement programs as well, so that employees who may want to further their education, and it's important to us that it's not just matriculating degrees. You may have people who are a chief engineer who may want to go out and get a certificate in a particular trade. And so we provide that type of financial support as well to allow people to continue to grow professionally. On the dream side, we're a much smaller organization. I mentioned we had the mighty 8 when we acquired the team. We've now grown to about 40. That's in the so-called off season. During the season, obviously that number expands because you have a large seasonal staff that you hire. And learning and development there is a little bit different. We have, for our ticketing team, we do have a sales academy. We love to hire people out of the sales academy where we bring them in, young professionals mostly, and sort of teach them the sales or ticketing sales trade. And then it's a lot about making sure people feel supported in their roles, and if they want to go out and get the opportunities to make sure that they're able to do that from programs like yours or anywhere else. Also from conferences, as you could imagine, and I know you guys sponsor one of the big ones. There's a lot of sports conferences that people like to take advantage of.
So staying on the sports theme, just wanted to get your thoughts on what's sometimes been called the Caitlin Clark effect on the WNBA. Are there parallels in the business world? Your thoughts on the superstar effect versus teams?
Basketball is a team sport. Business is a team sport. And so while I would never deny the impact that Caitlin Clark has had on women's professional sports, and certainly not on the WNBA, she hasn't done it alone. And there are, to me, I've always felt that the team dynamic, it's been so important to who I am as a leader, and the way I like to lead. So I'm always a big believer in, we can have superstars, and who doesn't love rising stars in their organization? But it's about building teams and putting the right pieces, even if you have a superstar, around that superstar. Caitlin can't go play a game alone. She has to have 4 other people on the court with her, right? And on our team, Ryan Howard can't go out and play, right, the game alone. She has to have 4 other people around her. As it turns out, we added some nice pieces this year in free agency. But for me, it's always team comes first. No matter where you are, I think the one thing I would say that I think is important, these new young stars, because of changes that happened in the last few years around NIL, the rise of social media, these young players are coming into the league as stars in a way that some of their predecessors and folks who have been in the league longer weren't. Not because they have greater skills, but because they're coming out and they may have 1 million+ followers already on social media. They may already have, corporate endorsements in a way that was never allowed. And so when I think about what has caused some of this change, I always point back to some of those. The change in those things has really changed the visibility and in many cases, the star power of some of these young players coming into the league now.
Well, I see we're approaching the end of the hour, so I just want to make one last call. If anybody has any final questions they'd like to ask in the comments section, please feel free to submit them now. I also want to remind our audience, if you're interested in learning more about what we've been talking about today, we have some upcoming MIT Sloan executive education programs. We have data-driven teams that's going to be running in April, which is an online program, so you can join from anywhere in the world, as many of you are doing today. And then we also have a women's leadership program that's coming up June 17th through the 20th. I believe there are seats available for both of those classes. And of course, we have a whole portfolio of programs that run both online and here on the MIT campus throughout the year. So we'd encourage you to explore our portfolio of programs. As I mentioned, they're very short, focused programs that really have a very strong focus on delivering impact and actionable knowledge that you can use in your personal and professional lives. Suzanne, any final thoughts from you in terms of advice or guidance you'd like to leave with our audience today?
People who know me know my advice to young professionals always is the same. And I don't know how many young professionals we have with us today, Rob, but it's always to go be your authentic self. Be comfortable in your own skin. Don't think you need to be somebody else when you come into the workplace. And that has someone gave me that advice, years ago. I thought it was a little bit dicey at the time. I had switched firms. I had come into the firm. I was a gay woman coming into a firm in the mid 90s, and that wasn't really, necessarily at the time incredibly popular. And when I asked her what I needed to do to be successful at the new firm, I was thinking she was going to tell me work with this person, work with that person. And she just said, be yourself. And that was, to me, like really good advice, because it's really difficult to be your best if you're trying to be somebody else, or if you're trying to do something differently. I think we are all at our best when we can be ourselves and bring our best selves to work. So be yourself, find a work environment that allows you to be yourself. I think that's incredibly important. And that's the culture we try to cultivate at Northland and at The Dream.
That's great. It's a great final thought, but I do want to sneak in one last question. I want to ask you how your March Madness bracket is holding up.
I'm going to say, Rob, for the first time ever, I did not submit a bracket on either the women or men's side. At Northland, we have a pool on, for both the men's and women's. I literally just missed the deadline. So, and given some of the upsets on the men's side, I may not have been sad, because I would have been like hovering near the bottom. On the women's side, I would have still been doing good though. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for your time today, sharing your experiences both in sports and business. I hope all of you that have joined us from around the world have enjoyed today's webinar. I believe that a recording will be available as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, we like to run these webinars fairly regularly. So want to thank you joining. Suzanne, thank you again for your time today. And we'll hope to see you back at the MIT community, whether it's in a program or one of these online webinars again soon. Until then, take care, everybody.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.